Welcome to the Sage Planning Solutions Podcast. Join us as we help you navigate life's financial obstacles and find financial freedom. We will cover the major pitfalls that can derail your journey to financial independence. Get ready to learn, grow, and prepare for your best possible financial future.
Securities and advisory services offered through Cateray Grant & Company Incorporated, a registered investment advisor and member FINRA SIPC. Cateray Grant and Sage Planning Solutions are separate and unaffiliated entities. The information provided here is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered an individualized recommendation or personalized investment advice. Any opinions or forecasts contained herein reflect the subjective judgments and assumptions of the authors only and do not necessarily reflect the views of Cateray Grant & Company Incorporated. Investing is subject to risks, including loss of principal invested. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. No strategy can assure a profit nor protect against loss. This information is not intended to be a substitute for specific individualized tax, legal, or investment planning advice. Neither Cateray Grant & Company Incorporated nor its registered representatives or employees provide tax or legal services. Please note that individual situations can vary. Therefore, the information should be relied upon when coordinated with individual professional advice.
Bob, thank you for joining us again. We're always thrilled to have you on.
Bob, I'll make it quick and simple. What is it that you are perceiving, and can you communicate that to us? Because our clients are sort of trapped between 4 different channels of financial news media, and all of them are garbage. And we want to be able to give them a chance to just kind of, as a mutual friend of ours says, shred the narrative and do the math.
Here's the deal. Your clients should be going between zero media in terms of television news when it comes to financial market, literally zero. There's no reason to watch TV. Like regularly, I don't watch CNBC. I barely watch Bloomberg. You know, every once in a while, out of the corner of my eye in the morning for maybe half an hour before I get fed up and turn it off. There's no reason to watch any of these networks. Financial channels. Okay, now watch me never get invited again, but that's no big deal. So, I mean, never get invited again by them. So there's no reason to watch them. They're just there to agitate people. You know, it's kind of like, you know, Howard Cosell back in the day. People watched it because they hated him. Okay, and so there's no reason to watch them. You're not going to really get any information that isn't already embedded in market prices. Just ignore them. Here's the deal. This is kind of counterintuitive or runs counter to the narrative that's out there. Equities were significantly overpriced at the beginning of this year. And they've been significantly overpriced for a while. Now, not as significantly overpriced as they turned out to be in 2008, not nearly as significantly overpriced as they were at the peak of the internet boom, the original one back in the year 2000, but they were overpriced. Now, I'm not saying that tariffs haven't mattered. They've definitely mattered. They have been the catalyst. All the news about tariffs have definitely been the catalyst behind all these gyrations in equity prices and bond prices over the last few months. Absolutely 100%. But if it hadn't been tariffs, it would have been something else because equities were overvalued. My view is that equities are still slightly overvalued, but not nearly as much. So I would still be a little shy on equities or hedged or buffered for equities relative to where you would normally have a client based on their age, their risk profile, financial goals. I dipped into the market on that Monday a couple of weeks ago when I was hitting that low, you know. I moved about 10% of my investable assets. There are actually more than that. We're sitting in a money market, okay? And I took 10% and bought U.S. equities at that moment, that Monday. And so I'm up around, 8% since then, just on that money, whatever. But equities were overpriced. Now they're not nearly as much. The catalyst has been tariffs. If it weren't tariffs, it would have been something else. It's like Rosanna Dana said, it's like if it's not one thing, it's another. Or was that Emily Latella? I'm kind of a little lost at this point. It's been a long time. It's been 40 years since. But if it's not one thing, it's going to be another. Equities are still overpriced, but not as much as they were.
So what's really happening with these tariffs? They're on, they're off. He's playing 4D chess. He's not. No, we're going to increase them to 145%. We're not. We're going to go back down to 50, which is back, where they were 45, whatever, coming into this year. What's really happening? Like you said, it is gyrating this market. And we were at a First Trust event, and I asked Strider, when's the last time that in the rolling 5-year period, you've seen 3 crashes and potentially 3 recessions? And he said, never. What is your opinion on what's really happening with these tariffs and with the impact and the voice of reason? You have Navarro conflicting with Lutnick and Lutnick conflicting with Bessent.
Yeah, the problem is that the president tends to agree with whomever has been in the room last. And so you're seeing policy whipsawed all around because Hassett has a view, Bessent has a view, Navarro has a view, Lutnick has a view, and he's listening to all of them without a real solid process for bringing all those views together comprehensively in a sustainable way where he's not going to have to reverse himself all the time. And that hasn't been done. I don't think he's, the one virtue of, of a Clinton White House, an Obama White House, a Bush White House, is that the policymaking process, although it usually took too long, once they came out to a formulated policy, they could stick to it. It was sustainable for that particular administration, whether it was a good policy or a bad policy. So maybe the policymaking process regarding tariffs, particularly because the president can seemingly act on these things unilaterally without congressional input whatsoever, maybe it should be a process that's sustainable. And the administration, this one doesn't work that way. So that's a problem. Here's the deal. This is a theory I have, and I'm not completely sold on it myself. But if the president's real goal here was a geopolitical realignment vis-a-vis China in a way where we didn't try to make China feel completely singled out, it wouldn't look that much different from what he's done so far. Because China's not singled out completely. They've had the tariffs raised the most on their country compared to everybody else, but they haven't been singled out. We've been talking even about neighboring allies like Mexico and China and Canada raising tariffs on them. So if our goal is to raise tariffs on China, but without making them feel so singled out that they might invade Taiwan in reaction to it, it wouldn't look too much different from what we've done. Now, that doesn't mean that is the explanation, but it could be an explanation. I think people are somewhat overlooking that. I do think tariffs will come down on China relative to what's been recently announced, but they're probably not going to come down to what they were in the Biden administration. I think they'll remain substantially higher than that. And once that's in place for a while, no administration, Democrat or Republican, can really afford to bring those tariffs down. Because if they do, and 6 months later, China invades Taiwan, then that administration looks ridiculous, right? They look like patsies. And so they get run out of town on a rail. So I think in the end, a lot of this is about China. That said, there are people in the administration who just believe in protectionism. Like Navarro really believes, he's a true believer in protectionism. Hassett definitely isn't. Bessent is a guy who pretends to believe in it to become Treasury Secretary because that's the capstone of his career. And Lutnick kind of he doesn't have any views. He just really likes to be in the room and be a part of the deal-making process because he thinks it's really cool because he already has enough money. And so he just likes being in Washington. But Navarro is the driving force behind the true believing protectionism within the administration. I think other than it's a little bit thinner. You just have people who are going along for the ride.
So one question that I have is the euphemism signal through the noise. You hear that quite a bit now. Mm-hmm. And in my heart of hearts, I had hoped that there was some grand strategy being put to work here, not just a real estate guy shooting from the hip, being not very cautious with the American industrialist. So with what you're saying here, and you said it was a theory, so we'll leave it at that. And geopolitical realignment. I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, you can't go after the guy. You have to go after 6 of them, take out one, just so you could basically say, hey, listen, this is kind of what I'm going to do going forward. And I was saying it because that's why you have he had that big clipboard of 26 different countries and say, we're going to go after them all, which is basically all just sort of window dressing for saying, China, you're going to have to play because everybody else has to play. Am I getting you right on that?
Yeah, I think that is right. Now, or at least the theory I just presented is consistent with what you just said. Okay, or vice versa, whatever. So here's the deal. It's a theory. It's not the Bob Stein theory. It's a theory. And maybe it comes from me, but I'm not completely sold on it myself because there really are true believing protectionists like Navarro in the administration. Now, does that mean it's not going to be erratic? No, it does not, unfortunately. Trump has been and will continue to be erratic in terms of policy implementation. So I can't say it won't be erratic at all.
With this protectionism, it's hurting, and it hasn't even took full force forward, is hurting supply chains, global supply chains. The cost with the import cost, it's a one-time tax, they say. However, there's inflation on that one-time tax. So it's not like it's a bump up and straight across. It's a bump up and then inflation compounded on top of that price. How do you explain to Main Street what tariffs really mean to them and how it doesn't really affect government as much other than the individual consumer?
Okay, so here's the way I look at it. Will tariffs increase prices for the individual things coming into the country? Okay, because they're widespread, almost certainly. Absolutely. Some countries like China with a higher tariff that they're facing are going to have to absorb some of the costs themselves. But generally speaking, it's going to raise prices for the items being tariffed. However, it doesn't necessarily increase inflation that much. And the reason it doesn't is because it doesn't alter monetary policy. And so what happens is American consumers and businesses are going to have to pay more for the particular items being tariffed that are coming into the country from abroad. But the vast majority of that increased spending has to come out of less spending for other goods and services, right? So have you noticed the companies getting really hit in terms of their stock prices, but more particularly their revenue projections? They're companies that produce good, like domestic companies, producing things domestically for our domestic U.S. consumers and businesses. Why? Well, people are going to pay more for the imported goods. That means they're going to have less money left over for other goods. What are those other goods? Things produced domestically for U.S. consumers. So they have been getting hit. Airlines, things like that. Okay, so airfares, we're riding domestic airlines, but we have less money left over for that, or anticipate less money left over for that. I'm actually more worried temporarily about the negative GDP impact of the tariffs than I am about the upward inflation pressure from the tariffs. Because I think the upward inflation pressure is going to be only small. It's the downward impact on the economy of domestically produced goods and services that's going to be greater here, counterintuitively. Now, we do have a GDP report out next week, next Wednesday, 6 days from now, and that's going to be close to zero. Okay, it could be slightly positive, could be a little negative, whatever. That's not really the tariffs themselves. It's importers front-running the tariffs. Imports go way up temporarily, and because of that, GDP is temporarily suppressed. Now, normally you would see lower GDP in the first quarter, higher GDP in the second quarter, because we're no longer front-running tariffs. We got tariffs. My worry is that the second quarter is not going to fully offset the damage from the first quarter. We have to wait and see. We don't have that data yet. We'll start getting data in industrial production and retail sales and all that whatnot for April in May. So we'll start getting that in mid-May, like 3 weeks from now. That's when I really think we'll start to see a little bit of this negative effect on GDP growth. I'm not worried about the first quarter, which is already going to be near zero. I'm worried about the second quarter.
Out of the GDP inputs, which ones specifically? Because there's consumption, business investment, government spending, exports minus imports. Yeah. Which ones do you think are going to be hit the most?
In the first quarter? Oh, it's going to be trade. Trade is going to be a large negative for GDP growth. Because basically what we're consuming domestically, the proportion coming from abroad will be higher because importers were front-running the tariffs. They're using their activity and time and operations to bring stuff from abroad because it's going to cost them more to bring it from abroad a couple months hence.
That makes sense. Pat, you look perplexed.
No, I'm looking at, as Bob's saying this, I'm thinking like what companies that are primarily based on U.S. revenue, not really companies, but what industries. And I'm thinking like energy and financials, utilities. That's what was going through my head is what will be able to sort of sidestep a great deal of this.
Yeah, that may be true. I'm not an investment strategist, as you know. I stay away from trying to translate the economic forecast into an investment forecast because we have smart folks at First Trust who do that probably very much better than I can ever do. So, you talk to those other smart people.
So what percentage impact do you think that GDP is going to have with all the stuff that's happening right now?
So the first quarter, I think it's a rear view mirror. I think the second quarter will be not fully compensating for the first quarter. So, yeah, it's hard to translate that. But I would not be surprised if we hit sometime over the next couple of months a new low for this cycle on the S&P 500, below what we've already hit.
Let me ask you a question that might be a bit out of your purview. And again, I mentioned grand strategy earlier. We talked about protectionism. And all of this was done under the guise of we need to reduce our deficit. At least that's what's been communicated. And this administration is very, very, they stick to the whole, hey, draw their eye line over here and let's do other things over here. Let's harp about these stories so we can get these other things done behind the scene, at least as it seems to me. $17 trillion worth of debt is coming due this year. And one of the things that it seems that Trump has communicated is if we can get interest rates lower, of course, when he says it, he just sounds like a real estate schlep. But
hey, Pat, I'm going to stop you right there.
All right.
Is this that theory I see that the Trump administration secretly wants a recession because it'll make the rollover of the debt and the financing of the debt easier?
It had crossed my mind.
Okay, that's okay. As you know, because you've seen me on stage, I happen to be a blunt man. So I don't know whether your listeners are listening to this, but I've seen this theory, and it's absolute BS. That is absolutely 100. There are very few times, because you know me, guys. I'll get on stage and I'll talk about percentages. This is 60%. This is 80%. There is 100% chance that this is false. 100% that this is false. There is no bleeping way that the Trump administration wants a recession so the rollover of the debt is easier. Okay, and I'll tell you why. Because, yes, we have to finance the national debt. The interest on the national debt is 3% of GDP. Okay, we've got another 20% of GDP going to other federal spending that will become more difficult to finance if there are lower receipts coming into the federal government. So, yes, the interest cost is, and we've written about this as a Monday morning outlook over the past month or so, which explains it more thoroughly. But the vast majority of federal spending is not interest on the national debt. Okay, where are you going to get the receipts to finance that? Okay.
Strider showed us a chart about that, and he was talking about Medicare and Social Security, and then the cost of debt, and then all the other ones, and really said even if you cut these out, we would still have a big deficit.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. That's a separate issue. That's like, can you really make substantial headway against the deficit without tackling entitlements? Okay. Right. So what he told you, what I've been telling crowds as well, but I don't do it as well as Strider. I'm not as good looking as Strider, so I don't get the credit. Okay. But here's the deal. Like if you take out Social Security, Medicare, national defense, interest on the national debt, and Medicaid, I do think we reform and change Medicaid, but the cuts don't happen right away. That's going to happen over time. If you take out those 5 segments of the annual spending of the federal government, that's 85% of the spending. Discretionary spending is only 15% of spending. And 15% of spending is roughly 3% of GDP. You completely eliminate social discretionary spending, which we're not going to do. We'll reduce it maybe relative to GDP. We're not going to eliminate it. If you completely eliminate it, you still have a budget deficit, an annual budget deficit of roughly 3.5% of GDP. Now it helps, okay, but you can't balance the budget by even eliminating social discretionary spending. You have to go after entitlements long term. However, they don't want a recession because long-term financing of the national debt will become tougher to do. Because remember that spending in the short run will go up faster if you have a recession. Unemployment benefits, Medicaid benefits. Some people will retire a little bit earlier on Social Security. More people will take Social Security disability. It'll become hard. And all the sob stories on TV and on the radio and on podcasts will generate sympathy up on Capitol Hill to do some sort of temporary spending plan. So it's not going to help the financial position of the federal government to have a recession. Plus, it takes several years to roll over the debt.
The other question I have regarding that, and a lot of people, they're not getting it. Does the Fed even need to cut rates right now? Number one. Number two, they only impact short-term rates. Meanwhile, long-term rates have been trending higher.
Yes.
So what's this obsession with cutting the short-term rates?
Well, okay, here's my view. Today, monetary policy is modestly tight. How can I say that? How can I come up with that? Because we know that inflation, overall inflation and core inflation, are both down modestly over the past year. It hasn't come down to where we want it to be. It hasn't come down to that 2% Fed target, but it is lower than it was a year ago, right? Slightly. Inflation, prices are going up, but the pace of inflation is going down. The pace at which prices are going up is a little bit slower than it was a year ago. That tells me that monetary policy is modestly tight, that if we maintain monetary policy where it is today, that inflation is going to continue to gradually come down and would probably, sometime over the next several months, breach that 2% PCE inflation target that the Fed has set. Now, I actually think the target should be lower than that. But for the Fed to maintain a target that's lower, like 1.5% or 1%, it has to convince the bond market that it's serious about that. And this Fed is never going to do that. So The target is 2%. We would, sometime over the next several months, I think we go below 2%. And so if we don't start cutting rates very gradually, I don't want to do it fast. We don't start doing it now, the economy might be overly slow over the next year. And so I do want to gradually cut rates. We're not talking about going from tight to loose if we cut rates by a quarter. Mm-hmm. Now, if the Fed announces there's an emergency and they got to cut rates 150 basis points, then they've totally screwed up. And technical term, okay? And they're going to have to come back with higher rates in the future because they will have totally overshot. However, a quarter point cut's not going to kill us.
Can I go back to a give the people what they want question?
Absolutely.
Does the Department of Government Efficiency move the needle over the next 2 or 3 years in its effectiveness in reducing?
Yeah, but it's not night and day. It doesn't mean that the total aggregate amount of discretionary spending is going to be lower. But even holding the line on discretionary spending would be a substantial improvement compared to what we've done for the past couple of decades. Substantial improvement. So in that sense, it does move the needle. And here's what's going on. I think this very different approach by the Department of Government Efficiency, Musk Group, and other efforts within the Trump administration, it's not just about cutting spending. It's about dismantling the ecosystem of DC liberalism, whether you like it or not, which is that you have lots of organizations, not-for-profit organizations, or superficially not-for-profit, that's their tax designation, if you will, with people making tons of money by being basically poverty pimps of various kinds and virtue signaling pimps. Go around saying, oh, I'm wiring the poor for internet so they can get porn in their house so their kids can learn or become educated and stuff, or making sure that people have access to X, Y, and Z and whatever. But these are basically, when I think about these jobs, they're basically a glorified version of what Reagan talked about in the 70s before he became president, which is like basically they're like welfare kings and welfare queens, except they don't live in tenements or shanty housing. They work in office buildings, and they live in Bethesda, Maryland, and McLean, Virginia, and they get paid $280,000 a pop for being a compliance officer or an HR executive at an NGO. And it might be multiple NGOs. So they get $280 a pop at each one. And they get to live high on the hog on federal spending and get paid more than they would than even if they work for the government, really barely do anything and get to hang out with their fellow liberals. And that's the way it goes. And I'm not saying conservatives don't have their own grifts. They absolutely do. Okay, and I could talk about that extensively as well, with all the big banks living off the fact that they can get access to the Treasury Department at any time there's a crisis. Yes, absolutely. We have all sorts of people with a grift going on. Not us, of course, But First Trust will never have access to the Treasury Department. That's just the way it goes. But the NGO grift has come to an abrupt end. And so you have a lot of people out there in the DC metropolitan area who are living high in the hog, relatively speaking, compared to what the demand for their services would be in the true profit-making private sector, who have to go out and get real jobs. So people often say, we have to bring in lots of immigrants because there are jobs Americans won't do. Picking nuts in Fresno. Well, maybe these NGO workers can be shifted to Fresno and they can bake in the hot sun picking walnuts or almonds or whatever is grown out there. So I do think it moves the needle in terms of dismantling that ecosystem that part of the DC crowd was feasting on for decades. But ultimately, you got to touch entitlements if you really want to substantially and systematically go after overspending in DC.
Who has the chutzpah to do that? Somebody 2, 3, 4, 5 presidents from now? I mean, how does that ever even get touched?
Okay, so, my view is that Social Security, the Democrats win, there'll be a general revenue transfer into the Social Security Trust Fund like was done with COVID. I'm not saying that's good, but that's what's going to happen eventually. And then they'll do some modest changes to Social Security, like raise the retirement age slightly, modestly reduce the generosity of the benefit system in Social Security for upper income beneficiaries. Okay. But mostly it's going to be tax hikes, including a payroll tax hike eventually after they first do a general revenue transfer. Medicare, the Republicans are going to do it. They're going to convert it into a premium support system rather than a fee-for-service program. It already is premium support when it comes to the drug benefit. So they'll just do more of that and then squeeze that program over time, maybe raise their retirement age slightly, whatever, from 65 to 67, stuff like that. But that's not going to happen under Trump. Trump's not going to touch Medicare. Mm-hmm. And maybe it'll be a future Republican, maybe J.D. Vance or somebody else who does it, but it's not going to happen under Donald J. Trump.
So let me ask you, it's a very important question because we're getting a lot of protests where we are regarding Medicare. So no matter what the party, will either party be squeezed to make that decision? Or will it only be a Republican Party?
No, only the Republican Party. But Democrats will secretly be okay with it for Medicare because Medicare is for senior citizens who are disproportionately older white. Right. And so those people are voting for the Republicans. So they'll just sit back and watch the Republicans get hammered by their own voters for cutting Medicare. OK, Medicaid, that's where the Democratic voters. Right. Not all. I'm painting with an overly broad brush. There are white seniors who vote Democrat. There are people getting Medicaid who vote Republican. Absolutely. People in Mississippi and Arkansas and so forth. Absolutely. And in many other states around the country. But on Medicaid, I think the Democrats have more of a sense of ownership of that program and will be more upset about it. And also because one of the basics of Obamacare was expanding Medicaid. And so they feel a sense of ownership for that. And if there's a cutback to Medicaid, it's also a cutback in Obamacare's signature program or President Obama's signature program.
Unexpected outcomes. Last time that we talked, I asked you, I said, what is there something that you and your colleagues privately talk about some sort of, parenthetical bomb waiting to go off? Let's talk about the other side of that coin. What are some things that you maybe see developing that, hey, this actually could be a good knock-on effect?
Yeah, I think AI could be hugely beneficial. I just think it's going to take longer to be implemented. But I'm thinking about things like being able to access engineering talent in India and elsewhere, and also basically replacing all those liberal arts degreed people who are overpaid and middle management who really don't do much except harass people who are actually doing things in corporate America, writing manuals that nobody ever reads because they just want the 3 bullet points. Well, I can do that with AI, right? So I hope I'm not upsetting too many of your clients, gentlemen. So hopefully that can take hold and lift the economic growth rate. It remains to be seen, though. I think a lot of the potential good news is already baked in the cake. Maybe we do see a revival in manufacturing in the USA. I think undermining higher education in the U.S. is probably good for the USA because there are way too many people going to college right now.
Yep.
And so not seducing people into taking loans that they can't afford and being taught worthless things when they're on campus is probably a good thing. And so I love what the Trump administration is doing by going after Harvard and making them a target. And hopefully they do it with a lot more of the higher education institutions around the country, because they're basically ripping people off, convincing 18-year-old kids to go there so that those kids can be a conduit for taking government aid and getting the government to give grants to these institutions that are just squandered.
That's a very delicate topic for a lot of parents, especially in our area here, San Francisco Bay Area. They want them to go to like a Harker Academy. Then from there, they want them to go to a Yale, a Princeton, or some other Ivy League college. They want them to be doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, engineers.
Yeah.
Where do you see that trend happening? Because that's what, I mean, then there's a high suicide rate here in Palo Alto. Kids jump in front of the Caltrain because of the pressures of getting a straight A, because all their other friends are getting straight A's. And
I'll tell you part of the reason this is happening. Okay, part of the reason there's so much pressure in certain communities.
Not status-seeking parents, right?
Well, but like, you look at the undergraduate populations at the leading institutions in the U.S., so supposedly most elective institutions, they haven't grown in proportion to the population of the U.S., right? Okay. No. That's number one. Number two, all these institutions have multiple tracks, okay? So the track of getting into these schools based purely on merit is extraordinarily narrow relative to where it was 40 years ago. The chance of a very smart kid, an outstandingly intelligent kid getting into Harvard is substantially lower than it was 40 years ago, because they're not just, the top institutions are saying, no, you're smart, but, right. The SAT has been gamed by the College Board so that it's really hard to tell the difference between a very smart kid and a super smart kid. Okay, because you can make multiple mistakes on the SAT and still get a 1600. Couldn't do that when I was a kid.
You get 400 points for just putting your name on paper.
Yeah, well, exactly. So it's really hard to tell the difference. And they do that so that they can take the child of the alum who gets a 1540, and then you have some like kid who never was able to take one of those classes, really coming from a public high school in the San Francisco Bay Area, who also gets 1540 with no advantages. But it's hard to tell the difference. Well, you know who's smarter, okay? Because that other kid, that smart kid probably got that special room where you got twice as much time to take the SAT, even though he had no handicap whatsoever, or she, whatever. Okay, so if you're a smart kid and want to get into Harvard today, it is much, much tougher than it was 40 years ago. And the same is true for all these highly selective schools, because they have tracks for DEI. They have more tracks for athletes, given Title IX. They have more tracks because they have more alum today, more children of alum today than there were children of alum 40 years ago, right? Okay, so it's snowball. So that's why the kids are jumping onto tracks in the train. They need to get rid of two things. Number one, the essays. That's just a way for the admissions people to justify their jobs because somebody has to read them, okay? And then it's for signaling, you get to fill this quota or whatever. And they need to get rid of the teacher recommendations. Okay, I want a kid who is not recommended by their teachers. I want the kid in class, okay, maybe I'm self-dealing here based on who I was as a child.
You sound like Pat Bennett right now, I was about to say.
Yeah, I want the kid who every teacher thinks is a total asshole. That's the kid who should get into the school. I want the kid who the teachers hate. Really smart kid who all the teachers hate. I want the kid who everybody hates.
That was me, because I was always asking questions, and then eventually they're like, okay, we'll talk after class. I'm like, yeah, but it's about the material you're talking about right here.
And here's the other thing, and you need to recognize this. I have 3 kids. I just did the college tours with my youngest kid. So I was reminded of this, which is that, you're going to have opportunities for career paths that the average person doesn't have. Okay. And so the school many years from now, or 10 years later, when they're looking to hire admissions people and administrators and faculty, it's going to be hard for a selective, not even a highly selective, but a selective institution to get somebody who went to that school to actually work at that school. That would cost them a ton, right? and they don't do anything much productive anyhow. And so they're going to have to hire people who went to lesser institutions.
Yeah.
So within selective colleges in America, the administrators and the faculty continuously get dumber relative to the smart kids who go to that school. And there's really no way around it. And then, do you know what you have? You have faculty and administrators who are resentful of those very same institutions and think that objective standards for determining how prepared students are to learn at that institution, there must be something wrong with them because I couldn't even get in.
I want the kid that has the work ethic, that works a full-time job and goes to school full-time. I want that kid.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's another level of daycare. A lot of this stuff,
yes.
You know, it's embarrassing, and you know, it's kind of all these feckless institutions. It just reminds me of what I used to think of Europe, right? Of a lot of these, like, why are they studying, getting degrees in these things? Like, how are you going to contribute? But that's who we are now, and it's what we've dumbed down to.
Hey, well, listen, gentlemen, this has been fantastic. But I see we've gone 45 minutes, and I believe that if your clients were forced to listen to me any longer, they'd get bored and hate me.
Better you than us. You know what it is? They want to know that we're talking to smart people who have something to say beyond the nonsense that everybody hears. So with that, we thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you as always, Bob. We appreciate it.
Bob, we appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, Bob.
Adios.
Thanks for listening to the Sage Planning Solutions podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. If you want more information, visit our website at sageplanningsolutions.com.